We have seen many scenes like this that you are looking at play out over the past couple of weeks. Demonstrators getting together to demand an end to racial injustice and call for further police reforms. It's leading to race relations being a major topic of conversation among families across the country, friends, government and community leaders. And today, in particular, the conversation must continue. Today is Juneteenth. It is an official holiday marking the end of slavery in the United States. And it's now being more widely recognized in cities across the country and by dozens of high-profile companies. Before this year, many people were not familiar with the significance of Juneteenth. So to talk about it and give you some context, we are joined by a special guest this morning, Dr. Wornie Reed, who is the director of the Race and Social Policy Research Center at Virginia Tech. His history is well beyond textbook. He marched alongside Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. himself and says the recent protests are playing a major role in change. So Dr. Reed, I want to thank you so much for joining us and ask for you to give us a little context about Juneteenth, because outside of, in particular, the state of Texas, it was not as well known as a celebration. And why was the emancipation or the end to slavery celebrated at a different time in the state of Texas than elsewhere in the country?
Well, it's quite simply that it's celebrated at a different time in Texas because freedom came at a different time in Texas. It came 2 months after other slaves were freed at the end of the Civil War. Blacks in Texas did not know they were free for about 2 months after the end of the Civil War. They had been technically freed 2.5 years earlier by the Emancipation Proclamation signed by President Lincoln. But of course, as I put it, the Union had to win the war first before those slaves in the Confederacy could be free, because the Confederacy paid no attention to that proclamation. But then when the Civil War ended, then these slaves were free, and it took 2 months for the news to get to Texas. There are all kinds of stories about why that's the case. The most prominent one is that the plantation owners blocked people from coming to deliver the news so that they could have the slaves work to deliver another crop before they were freed. That's one story. Another story is that there was a messenger on his way right at the end of the Civil War, and that messenger was killed on the way. So there are all kinds of stories as to why it took so long, and it's not clear exactly why. I argue that all of these stories could be true. But then in
Dr.
Texas...
Reedman.
Dr. Reedman. Yes?
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. No, I was just going to conclude by saying that in Texas, they got the news on June 19th, 1865. And so on June 19th, 1866, they celebrated the anniversary of the knowledge that they were free. And that became a big celebration in Texas throughout the end of the 19th century. And it moved on into the 20th century. And it eventually became a state holiday in Texas. And it spread to the rest of the country. But it kind of became dormant as a wide celebration during World War II. And had a brief period in around 1950 when it was celebrated. But then after that, there were just very few celebrations until the mid-1970s when it took off again. And then it became larger and more popular than it had ever been.
Dr. Reed, I happen to have had the occasion to cover Juneteenth celebrations while working as a reporter in Texas, and coming from California, had never been introduced to the concept before, and it was very celebratory and lots of music and the reading of the proclamation, and so it was an insight into a moment in history that I had no concept of. So it's nice for us to share these conversations and your perspective. But let me get to a different topic. Over the years, as you have seen many hurdles be crossed in the fight for racial equality and social justice. And taking you back to the days of Dr. Martin Luther King, is it disheartening to find that we are still having these conversations in the year 2020, or does it make you feel hopeful that a new generation is laying eyes on an issue and sharing in the perspective that the African American community deserves change?
Well, actually, both. It's disheartening that we still have to deal with these issues, but I have been arguing the reason we still have to deal with them is that we had no national movement toward racial progress for about 40 years. So as a result of what's been happening in the last 6 years, and really expanded a lot by what's happened in the last 2 or 3 weeks with all the protests and demonstrations, I'm very, very pleased because I'm just pleased to see that we now have a movement toward racial progress, and this one it seems to be wider and with more depth than anything we've seen in at least 40 years.
Dr. Reed, before we wrap up, briefly, can you give advice to members of other communities who want to support this change and they want to be allies to the Black community as this movement and push moves forward? How can they effectively be allied in this fight?
It's going to be hard for me to summarize that in a minute or two, but I would suggest that they try to do what we do here in Southwest Virginia, a somewhat rural area that is somewhat small, but we have a substantial process by which we are addressing these issues. And we call it the dialogue on race, even though dialogue is a misnomer. We sit and talk, where we sit and talk about specific issues and develop means by which we resolve specific racial issues. So one of the things they could do, they could go online and look us up and see what we do and try to do that. And that would give an illustration of how people can deal with the issues right in their own communities. And then to connect with the larger, more national areas, there are all these national organizations that people can hook up with and begin to try to understand the arguments that they are making so that interested persons can begin to assemble and make these arguments locally, but addressing national as well as local issues.
Dr. Reed, thank you so much for your perspective today and for sharing this information and really new conversations that we're having here on Good Morning Arizona. So appreciate you. Have a great day.
Okay, thank you.